like lower standards in education? Or
Lower standards never, but often
okay.
a setback in the number of students who came back
Uh,
or who enrolled. And it's been sort of pattern that once you increase tuition, there's always a drop-off in the students who come the following year. It's probably not going to happen this year because students are discovering that it is more expensive, that they can no longer afford to go to the more expensive places. So $4,600 is still a lot cheaper than $40,000.
yeah.
So that we are finding a good number of students, first of all, who are transferring to Brooklyn College from the expensive places, and secondly, who are applying to us first, although in better times they would have applied to Princeton, Harvard, or Yale. So this year is a bit of an exception, but by and large there's been a correlation between three things. One is bad economic times, the second one is a spike in tuition, and the third is a drop-off, for 1 year usually, in enrollment.
Any other questions about the Kimmich system? All right. So now just moving on to your general experience during the time of the 70s.
Okay.
You said you were unemployed for
3 weeks.
Yeah. Why did that happen, and what was your experience during that time?
Well, it happened because the state wanted to save money. So by not paying us, they saved 3 weeks of salaries across the university, which when you consider all the faculty members was a nice tidy sum. And the state argued that the university to some extent would have, or the university staff, faculty and staff would have to bear some of the consequences. And so they didn't pay us. And as I said, we were told to turn up and get in line at the unemployment office and to sign up for unemployment benefits, which would come to us if we were unemployed for, I've forgotten, X numbers of weeks. And it didn't happen because we then got back on the payroll. The experience was a little scary because we didn't know whether we had jobs. In fact, for unemployed, for untenured, I'm not unemployed, untenured faculty, the entire summer was a scary period because the deal, and this is where Rowadin comes in and MAC comes in, the deal to transfer the university from the city to the state took quite some time to make. The state didn't jump up and say, what a wonderful idea it is to take over the city university. They were trying to resist having to absorb many of the city's obligations because that was going to be on the taxpayers, on the tax rolls. And so it took some time that summer, under terrific pressure and with a lot of anxiety, to make the deal that transferred the senior colleges to the agency, transformed it into a state agencies and transferred the responsibility to the state. Those of us who were not tenured, even people who were tenured, would get sort of weekly bulletins, which were often contradictory, which were never upbeat. They're always somewhat pessimistic. We want to inform you, but we don't quite know what's going to happen. And so that on the receiving end of this, people began to start looking for other jobs, and it was not a good time to look for other jobs. They were thinking of going back to school, if those who were still not finished. There were all sorts of planning, and I remember talking to my colleagues who were also anxious about this, about what are we going to do if we don't have a job in September. And being unemployed for 3 weeks was a great deal better than not having a job at all. But we were very worried until sometime in late August. We got a letter saying report forward on whatever it was, 1st September, and we knew we still had a job. But that summer, especially for the untenured people who were sort of on the verge of being let go, was a very anxiety-provoking summer. And few of us have ever forgotten that feeling of just not knowing what's going to happen to you. We had all started with high hopes, with doing lots of good teaching, with being, I have always said Brooklyn College was the best job I ever had. And suddenly, without, they didn't say, you got a job or you don't have a job, they said nothing, or the equivalent of nothing. So that I would get these missives from my department chair in the Department of History, where I was a professor, saying, we don't know anything further, but it doesn't look good. that's really encouraging. I mean, you can imagine. And we got messages, rumors, of course, were rife. We got messages saying that so-and-so and so-and-so were no longer going to be with us, and the department would have to make some further cuts. And you're going to speculate, who's it going to be? Is it going to be you? Is it going to be me? So this was not a happy summer, the summer of '76.
Correct. Any other questions? All right, so the last question would be, is how would you describe the lives and times of the 70s? Like in general terms, really general terms.
In general terms? Well, it was a decade in which we were affected very generally as the rest of the population with the Vietnam War, and how that became a question of especially affecting the young and the draft. Many students went to college in order to escape the draft. It was still possible to get a deferment by going to college, but we all knew that sooner or later somebody in our class would have to be drafted, and that was really a psychological burden on the faculty, not to mention the students, but also on the faculty who were doing their best to protect students that they did not want to go, knowing how inequitable that is. I mean, people who didn't go to college were drafted. So how do you defend morally the fact that you're trying to protect some here, whereas others have to pay the price? So the Vietnam War in general cast an enormous pall on that decade, number one. Number two, we all watched, I think, with fascination, the dissolution of the Nixon administration. This was a administration which was not widely liked, which seemed to be engaged in criminal activity, and you were waiting day by day for the latest revelation on what's going to come out, and whether or not the president was going to be impeached, and whether or not the president was going to leave. It was an extraordinary period of involvement in national politics. It was also the third thing I would say of the 70s was that we were trying to absorb the major changes of the 1960s. The civil rights movement, which in part led to open admissions, the women's movement, which suddenly gave opportunities to women that they did not have before, the overall change in attitudes, in culture of the 1960s. The 70s were a somewhat tighter period. They weren't as flexible, they weren't as light, as open as the 60s, but we were all trying to absorb what had happened in the last 10 years. All of it had essentially grown up with the student uprising of 1968, with the assassination of the Kennedys, of Martin Luther King, and so forth. These are things that took some time to heal, to absorb, and to digest. So the early half of the 70s was for us a period of great involvement in national affairs, and secondly, of coming to terms with the change that we had all undergone in the 60s. The second half of the 70s, for us here locally, was dominated by what had happened to us at Brooklyn College and at the university. I mean, you clearly had a different administration in Washington, but the focus was, how are we going to get out of this what has happened to us? The city has gone bankrupt. We do not know whether the city is going to get back on its feet. Can we survive this year? Do we go beyond this? So we became less, how should I put this, less interested in the larger, broader national questions than we became interested in the local questions.